We always hear about how big space is, like practically infinite. But what happens if we end up, like, really messing it up with all our junk? Today, we're doing a deep dive on space debris, and this article, Space Debris, The Dark Side of Humanity's Reach for the Stars, doesn't sugarcoat things. It's kind of alarming, actually. So, expert speaker, thanks for joining me to break this down. Are we, like, seriously at risk of making space exploration impossible just because of all the stuff we've left up there?
Yeah, it's definitely a growing concern, and this article does a good job of laying out the risks. But, the good news is it does talk about some potential solutions too.
Okay, good. So, just so we're all on the same page, this article defines space debris as basically anything we send into orbit that's, well, just taking up space now. Old satellites, rocket parts, even little bits and pieces from when things crash into each other. I couldn't believe it, but even a tiny speck of paint can cause major damage when things are moving that fast.
And we're talking really, really fast. I mean, these things are whipping around the Earth at like over 17,500 miles an hour, so even something small can pack a serious punch.
So, how much stuff are we talking about exactly? The article mentioned like hundreds of thousands of trackable objects, but then millions more that are too small to even track. And with companies putting up these mega constellations of satellites like SpaceX with their Starlink project, it just seems like it'll keep getting worse, right?
Oh, absolutely. And these mega constellations, they're supposed to do good things like provide internet access around the world, but they also mean way more objects in orbit. And that means a higher risk of something called, get this, the Kessler Syndrome.
Okay, hold on. Lots of junk flying around super fast, we get it. But what's the real danger here? I mean, the article mentioned risks to the satellites we use all the time, right?
Exactly. Imagine losing things like GPS, satellite TV, even the ability to monitor climate change from space.
Yeah.
We really rely on those things. Even one collision could have a domino effect and mess things up big time.
And this isn't just a theory, is it? The article talked about an actual collision back in 2009, something about a Russian satellite and an Iridium communications satellite.
Yeah, and that one event, it created like thousands of pieces of debris. And each one of those is a potential bullet that could cause more damage, which gets back to that whole Kessler Syndrome thing that we were talking about. This article goes into it.
So this Kessler Syndrome, they named it after this NASA scientist who came up with the idea back in the 70s, right? So what exactly is it and why is it such a big deal?
Okay, so Kessler's theory, it basically says that as more and more stuff gets launched into space, the chances of things crashing into each other obviously goes up, right? But here's the scary part. Each collision creates even more debris, which leads to more collisions and on, like a chain reaction.
So it's not just that space is getting messier, it's that at some point we may not be able to use it at all because it's just too risky to send anything up there.
Exactly. Certain orbits could literally become no-go zones. That would be a disaster for space exploration and our reliance on space technology.
Wow, kind of makes you think twice about watching satellite TV, doesn't it? But the article did have some hope, which is good. It talked about tracking debris better and some pretty futuristic solutions, too. I mean, space lasers to get rid of space junk? That's pretty wild.
Definitely not as crazy as it sounds, actually. There are some really exciting advancements in the works. But before we get into specific solutions, I think we need to step back and look at the bigger picture here.
So it's not enough to just, like, invent some cool gadgets to clean up after ourselves, right? We need a totally different way of thinking about how we use space.
You got it. It's about moving from this launch it and forget it mentality to one that's more about, sustainability, thinking long term. This article brought up designing things for minimal debris, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, that really caught my eye too. Like designing satellites that burn up completely when they fall back to Earth instead of becoming more space junk. And I think I read something about satellites that can actually deorbit themselves when they're done.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about things like giving spacecraft little engines so they can intentionally crash into the atmosphere, or even using these giant drag sails to slow them down enough to fall back down to Earth. It's pretty incredible stuff.
That's amazing. It seems like the technology's heading in the right direction at least. But is it happening fast enough? That's the thing.
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And it's not even just about the technology itself. We also have to deal with the whole, rules and regulations side of things. The article brought up a big one, which is that there really isn't a strong international agreement in place to make sure everyone's playing by the rules in space.
So we can have all these amazing ways to clean up space junk, but if there's no one to enforce the rules, it's not going to matter much.
Exactly. It's kind of like having traffic laws but no police to give out tickets.
Yeah.
The article mentioned the Outer Space Treaty, which is a starting point, but it was written way back in 1967. Talk about outdated.
1967. Wow, that's like before we even landed on the moon.
I know, right? It's ancient in terms of space exploration. So it doesn't really address the complexities of everything going on up there now, especially with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin getting into the game.
So, where do we go from here? We've got this outdated treaty, and in the meantime, everyone's focused on launching more and more stuff into space.
Well, the article did highlight some positive developments, too. Like, there are discussions happening at the UN about coming up with some new guidelines for sustainability in space. And there are already groups like the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, which is basically a bunch of different space agencies from around the world working together.
So kind of like a global space traffic control, trying to keep things organized and avoid collisions up there.
Exactly. But those are just a couple of examples. We're talking about a complex issue that needs everyone on board.
So it's not just governments and space agencies. Private companies are a big part of this too, especially the ones launching these mega constellations.
Absolutely. But to be fair, it seems like some companies are stepping up, like SpaceX. They've been working on ways to safely deorbit those Starlink satellites at the end of their lives.
Okay, well, that's something, I guess. So
Mhm.
we're making some progress, but it's slow going. But what about everyday people? What can we do about this besides, talking about it on this deep dive?
Honestly, just talking about it, spreading awareness, that's huge. You'd be surprised how many people haven't even thought about this issue at all. But beyond that, you can support companies that are trying to do things the right way. The ones prioritizing sustainability. And never underestimate the power of contacting your elected officials and telling them that space policy matters to you.
So it's kind of like any other environmental issue. In a way, what we do, even small things, it all adds up and makes a difference.
100%.
Yeah.
And it all matters because we're not just talking about protecting space here. This is about protecting our future right here on Earth, too.
Yeah, you're right. We've talked about the risks to communications, GPS, all that. But the article also mentioned the economic impact, right?
Exactly. Think about how much it would cost to replace a damaged satellite, not to mention the disruption to, well, everything. Communications, financial markets, even national security. It's all connected.
Makes you think, doesn't it? Suddenly, those futuristic solutions like space lasers don't sound so crazy anymore. Maybe they're what we need.
And speaking of solutions, you want to dive into some of those more specific ideas?
The space lasers are kind of cool, but here's the thing that's been bugging me. We keep talking about what happens if we don't do anything, right? Like, no more space exploration, all this economic damage, even like threats to national security. But what if it actually gets so bad that we just can't launch anything into space anymore? What does that even mean for us? Are we like trapping ourselves down here on Earth?
It's kind of a scary thought, right? And it's bigger than just like astronauts not being able to go into space. So much of our lives depends on being able to get to space. Think about it. Accurate weather forecasts, GPS, being able to communicate with people on the other side of the world, all of that relies on satellites.
Yeah, it's easy to forget how much we take all that stuff for granted. It's like we've become totally dependent on having access to space without even realizing it.
Exactly. This isn't some far-off problem. It's happening now, and it affects all of us, which is why we have to figure out solutions. And, like we've been talking about, this article does offer some hope.
Okay, good. So let's get into it then. We talked about international cooperation, designing things to minimize debris, but what about actually cleaning up the mess that's already up there? Is that where these space lasers come in?
Exactly. The article mentioned something called laser ablation. Sounds like something straight out of Star Wars, but it's a real thing.
Okay, so how does it work? Do we just like blast the space junk with lasers until it disappears?
Well, not exactly. I mean, the idea is to use these powerful lasers to push the debris into a different orbit where it's not a hazard, or even to break it down into smaller pieces that'll burn up in the atmosphere.
So, kind of like a high-stakes game of space billiards, but with lasers.
Yeah, something like that. But instead of a pool table, it's Earth orbit, and the stakes are a little higher.
I'll say. Okay, that's pretty cool. But I think the article mentions some other ideas too, like space nets and robotic arms. What about those?
Yeah, there are a bunch of different ideas out there. Some companies are developing these giant nets to capture big pieces of debris, while others are working on like robotic arms that could grab onto old satellites and pull them out of orbit. There's even an idea for a space harpoon.
A harpoon. Okay, now that's just awesome. But out of all of these options, lasers, nets, harpoons, which one is like the most promising?
Honestly, it's too early to pick a winner. They all have their own pros and cons. Like, take those lasers. You need a ton of energy to power them, and if you're not incredibly precise, you could accidentally hit a working satellite.
Oh, yeah, that wouldn't be good.
Not at all. It's a delicate balance. We need solutions that are effective, of course, but also incredibly safe. That's the challenge.
So it's not going to be one magic solution. It's going to be like a whole bunch of different things working together, right?
Exactly. And it has to be a global effort. Everyone working together, coming up with new technologies, and just as important, agreeing to some ground rules for how we operate in space.
Wow. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but I've got to say, even though this is a big, complicated problem, I feel, I don't know, kind of optimistic. It seems like we have the brains and the tech to solve this. It's just a question of whether we actually have the will to do it.
I think that's the big question, isn't it? What's it going to take for us to really step up and take responsibility for what we're doing to space and ultimately to ourselves?
That's a great point. Well, expert speaker, this has been a fascinating and kind of sobering conversation. Thank you so much for, for breaking it all down for us.
My pleasure. It's important to talk about these things.
Absolutely. And to you listening, we hope this deep dive has given you something to think about the next time you look up at the night sky. Space is vast, sure, but it's not limitless, and it's definitely not immune to the impact we have down here on Earth. The good news is, we're not powerless. We can make different choices. We can demand better from our leaders and the companies we support. We can be better stewards of the universe we're all a part of. So keep looking up, keep asking questions, and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time.